Wow, Karen, I had the privilege of knowing your mum and also speaking at her funeral. So it's been really moving to listen to this interview again. But how does it feel for you to sit and to talk, about all of this today and in this way?
Well, Nushra, it's not easy, and I thank you for asking the question, because it's tough stuff. Just kind of thinking about then, that was 5 years ago, and we had, the Syrian families and the children arriving. And now, recently we've had this, situation in Afghanistan, and so many more Afghan children are arriving, so it's tough. And thinking about how it was for me in my childhood, my mum's past, her history, it was always there, it was ever present, but it's not something that we spoke about, or really thinking about it. My father's history, which, he was also from an immigrant background. His family, his grandparents fled at the turn of the last century in the Russian pogroms. And that was never spoken about. So, in our family, my brother and I, we were raised as Jews. We knew we were different, but we were taught very, very much that these were not differences that you spoke about. Everything had to be understated, under the radar. You didn't talk about your parents' histories. I knew that we were different, and that difference was kind of imbibed, and it was always there as an overlay of, I suppose, fear. My mother spoke differently. I knew that we ate different food. When I went to school, I found that the environment in the school food, for example, so different, I couldn't eat it. I used to stuff my school dinners in my pockets and then bring it home and ask my mum and show it to her and say, what's this? Would you eat it? And couldn't eat it. And I didn't understand why so many other families behave differently. I didn't know what cornflakes were. I didn't understand why they didn't have salami for breakfast. So it's all those kinds of differences. And so talking about it and the power of silence is tough. But nowadays many of my friends, they talk about their family histories as part of their work. There are lots and lots of projects that have been established via, for example, the Holocaust Education Trust, the Association of Jewish Refugees, Second Generation Network. There are dozens of these groups and organizations which friends and colleagues are involved in. I'm not. This is not something that I do. My family always had the approach that this isn't about the individual. You don't talk about yourself. And I suppose we channeled our practices into focusing on the future and political activity around human rights and social justice.
Yeah. I knew a little bit about your mum's history, and we've heard from Amy some of the broader history about kinder transport. But can you tell us more about your mum's experience? And when you do that, you very kindly shared some really profound documents from that time, which I can go through as you're speaking, if that's okay, Karen.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's very good. We know that in our work that we do in social work, original documents are so important for children's life story work. And what I've shared with you here is some of the work and some of the documents that I would think are part of my mum's life story. She brought with very little, but she did have one suitcase. So shall I talk about her journey?
Yes, I think that would be really helpful for everybody that's listening to this.
Well, I mean, her early life, she came from a very wealthy, well-to-do family. They were merchants in a small, what wasn't that small, but very beautiful town in what was Czechoslovakia, in the German-speaking part, the Sudetenland, called Mariánské Lázně. She was bilingual, and she was both Czech and German. And this town was a very, very beautiful spa town. And as I say, they had the food shop, the provision shop, and they distributed food also to the surrounding villages. And during the 1930s, during her school life, it was when there was the rise of fascism. So by 1938, it was very clear that the area that she lived in was in grave danger, and it was then became occupied, as you heard in that little clip. And the very famous clip of Neville Chamberlain waving his piece of paper when he came back from Germany, and he tried to appease Hitler, the famous appeasement situation. This tiny little far off land, he'd given it away. Wasn't his to give away, but he'd given that away, and that condemned my family, apart from my mum, to death, really. So her parents somehow, to this day, none of us know how, because mum wouldn't ever talk about it, arranged to get her onto the Kindertransport. And she was one of those just over 600 children who came on the trains from Prague, known as the Winton trains. You had to have somebody here in the UK who would be your guarantor, who would pay. And you had to pay that £50, which goodness knows what that's worth, I mean, £50 was worth then a vast amount of money. And she had a great aunt who was an artist in Vienna and had come out the year previously. And it was that aunt, my Auntie Emmy, who by that stage was in Glasgow, who guaranteed that money and paid for mum to come out. And she came on a train that arrived here in mid-May 1939. So that's a picture of her, the label that she had around her neck. The previous picture was a copy of that's right, that's it. Those are the instructions. You can see her name, Margit Freudenberg, her number on the train there you can see. And that was, those were the instructions her family were given of what they could bring, what time to get to the station, what they could and they couldn't do. Everything was very, very strictly regulated and controlled. So, yeah, and this is a photo or a picture of the list of the trains that came from Prague, and hers is on there. And then the next one, that's the ticket of the train. Then they got off the train and got onto the boat at Harwich, from the Hook of Holland over, and then the last bit of the train journey, which was to Liverpool Street, where today you can see there are two statues. One on the top at Liverpool Street, and then one lower down on the platform. There's a long story about those two statues, but I won't go into that. And then, well, this really takes us to after the war. So I'll say a little bit more about what happened to her on the actual journey, and some of the things that she told us about. She did recall that, for example, as Amy has said in her presentation about the children being given hot chocolate in Holland, Mum did speak about the fear of the children on the train, remembering that she was one of the older ones. She was 17, so she only just sort of squeezed in. And she said that she remembered a long, forever really, the hot drink that they got, it was the first bit of hot food they'd had when they got to Holland, and the Dutch women who were so kind and came on the train with hot chocolate, and also the white bread. She'd never come across white bread before. She didn't understand what it was. She thought it was a kind of cake, but it wasn't. It was European, further south European white bread. So yeah, she arrived at Liverpool Street, and it was different for her. She wasn't placed in foster care because she was older. She had one day in London where she was taken on a sightseeing trip with one other girl who also went to Glasgow, and she tells the stories of how she couldn't believe what she was seeing when she went around London, and all these men in these funny top hats, and she thought everybody had gone to a funeral. She just couldn't understand why these people were dressed as they are, and that often made us talk about how the children arriving today must look at things and find the culture so alien, because certainly my mum did. Anyway, she was put on an overnight train to Glasgow, because that's where Auntie Emmy lived, but they didn't have the space for her to stay. They were living in one room, so she was put into service. The family who took her in, I've subsequently, since Mum's death, been put in touch with the now very elderly son of the family. And they thought they were, taking in a child in the rescuing sense. But Mum explained it that she thought, and because she had to do so much work there, that she'd been put into service. And she was used as a domestic help. And she stayed there for about a year until she turned 18 and became an adult. And then she moved out and took a job as a sort of a nursing auxiliary, a nursing assistant, hoping that she would be able to train in nursing in Glasgow. But they weren't allowed to. Foreigners, just as now, so little has changed, they weren't allowed to become qualified. So she left nursing again after another year or so, and then she moved south. She moved down into England, and she lived in Hertfordshire and London, doing various jobs to the rest of the war. And then in 1945, she went back.
So, okay.
Was that all right?
Thanks, Karen. So can you tell us a bit more about what happened from 1945?
Yeah, so, the war ends, you've got a huge movement of people around Europe. The camps have been, liberated, and Mum wanted to know what had happened, who survived, who hadn't. I don't know, because she found it so hard to talk about it. I don't know when she found out what, but I do know that she went back to Prague in 1945 to find out and to see what was what. Her brother had survived both Buchenwald and Dachau, but he didn't survive for into old age or anything like that. And it was in Prague, after she'd gone back, that she met my father. He was in the RAF, and he was doing a journalist story, and that's a story in itself, and I won't go into all the details. Suffice it to say, they met, and after a few days together in Prague, he then left and came back to England, and they wrote to each other, and eventually he brought her back to England, and that was quite a difficult task, but he managed it. And she came back to England, and they married and had 2 children, my brother and I, and the rest is kind of, history. But I think for her becoming a mother only 2 years after the end of the war, because my brother's a little bit older than me. And then I came along 2 years after that in 1951. I think that was very, very hard. And I think in social work terms, you know, maternal functioning after that kind of history and that sort of those experiences and the genocide and the impact of her childhood has always been very great, and is something that I think as social workers we're very aware of. And so for me in my early childhood, when I went to school, I can recall saying to people, oh, my mum's gone to school, because that's how she explained it to me. And although she'd been very well educated in many ways up to the age of 16, she then didn't have an education. I mean, when she came to England, she could already speak, you know, 5 or 6 languages, but she hadn't got any of the exams. So she went to a poly, as it was then, a polytechnic, and eventually went to North London Polytechnic to study to be a social worker. So I always grew up knowing about social work, and it was just a topic of conversation. During the 1970s, for example, in the early 1970s, I can remember seeing Social Work Today, as the magazine of BASW was called then, now called Professional Social Work, PSW, on the kitchen table. So, you know, because my mum was a BASW member from the 70s onwards, and after she died, there was a little obit about her in PSW. And yeah, she ran a citizens advice bureau, and, you know, was dedicated to improving the lives of others.
Yeah, you can see how strongly, you know, your mum has influenced your life. So how about if we now talk about your career in social work and some of your achievements. So I know that you became a head of service, firstly in the London Borough of Harrow. At one point, you were a chief executive of a project called the Refugee Arrivals Project, and then you spent quite a bit of time working for Kent County Council as their head of services, particularly around services for children who are seeking or were seeking asylum. And I know that at some time during that time is when I started to work for BASW and connected with you very early on in my appointment. And that is because, you know, through our parliamentary liaison officer at the time, somebody called John Metcalf, you know, he insisted that I needed to meet you because of the expertise and the knowledge that you have in working with unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and all of the issues that never go away, sadly. You know, we're still battling, aren't we, with so many of the same things. So you were a critical person for us and remain as such when it came to looking at whatever the legislation was then, because it's constantly changing. I know that we were working on a bill back then, which of course was steeped in controversy and was never ever about, you know, making things better. It's always about looking at human rights, isn't it? And also you presented to something called the Standard and Ethics Board in BASW, which is a UK board. It's now, I think it's called Policy, Ethics and Human Rights. Felicity Collier, and some people might know who she is because she used to be the chief executive of BAF, but she was the chair of the BASW Standard and Ethics Board. So, you know, again, it was a very important opportunity for the whole of, you know, BASW UK to be made aware of what some of these issues are. I mean, we spent hours and hours, didn't we, writing so many responses to government consultations. I mean, one of your areas of expertise undoubtedly is this complex area of so-called age assessment. So you've done so much work on that. We were very pleased, you know, many years ago to finally get membership of something called the Refugee Children's Consortium, I think it was called then, the RCC. But I think it's going to be more helpful if I hand over to you now, and perhaps you can tell us a bit more about what the RCC is now. It's changed its name, but you know, what is its focus, and very much about how your own identity and history has shaped your career in social work.
Oh, Nushra, thank you. Gosh, you've said a great deal there. Where to start? I'll park the Refugee and Migrant Children's Consortium for a moment, and I suppose really come back to, you know, the kind of the key driver into my career, and that's about, you know, how do we the importance of learning about oneself and taking one's identity, one's history, and knowing oneself into social work practice, and how, unless you understand yourself, I believe, and I think we all should, I don't think you can be there, be available to help others and hear and listen to their stories, because so much about what we do in social work is listening, active listening, and learning about others. So, you know, I've spent a lot of time and done a lot of work in understanding such concepts as, you know, for example, the transgenerational transmission of trauma, how trauma goes through generations. And, you know, I've done lots of group work, for example, of working with descendants of both victims and perpetrators of genocide. So I've been in a number of very significant groups with children of Nazis, and then learned a lot about, for example, and worked with people who've experienced genocides in Rwanda or from the Irish Troubles, and how we learn from history, or as the case may be, we don't learn from history. And I think that has also shaped a lot of what I do and what I've wanted to do, which is, you know, working with separated asylum seeking children, and sort of very much picking up and working with, for example, Alf Dubs, and, you know, the legislative changes that he has tried to introduce, not very successfully, but, you know, some of that work where, you know, I've been in presentation upon presentation with him, and, you know, I'm aware from my work that, you know, he's doing 1, 2, or 3 a week sometimes, you know, even into his fairly significant, you know, older years. And but just coming back to some of my roles, it wasn't Harrow, but Hillingdon. I mean, in Hillingdon and in Kent, I, you know, became, you know, the head of service for all of the provisions for all the unaccompanied asylum seeking children that arrived in those key ports. And in Hillingdon, I was there just after the famous Hillingdon judgment, where section 17 was moved and changed into all the children being accommodated under section 20 of the Children Act. And then very much involved in the development of age assessment work. And I wrote the original guidance, which became then what has become now known as the Merton Judgment, and I've been deeply involved. I mean, it's amazing to think there's over 20 years of policy work for asylum seeking children. And I managed to take that, and really aimed very much to take that directly into what was the RMCC, now the RMCC, and making sure that BASW had a strong voice and place at that table. And that is, it's a coalition, it's the Refugee and Migrant Children's Consortium. It's a coalition of voluntary sector and the charity sector organisations who deal and work with asylum seeking and migrant children, everybody from the little players to the huge big players. And it's a very, very important body, a consultative body, an influencing body, a campaigning body, a body which meets regularly with the Home Office, in the National Asylum Stakeholder Forum, children's segment subgroup. I mean, you know, we get completely, you know, tied up with all these different terms. And my history has been a powerful driver in my work with these separated children. And I identify with them, I connect with them, and I'm very driven and always will be to this area of work. I think maybe that kind of leads us on a bit to talking about the work now today. Skipping to that, perhaps.
Yeah, I think this is really taking us to my last question for you. So you are currently the chair of BASW's Special Interest Group on Immigration, Asylum and Trafficking, and there really is no let up in this area. I know that you have a very busy agenda. I'm just trying to get to the right slide. Sorry, everybody. You will see that my skills are letting me down now. But so I just wanted to finish, Karen, with some of the key issues that you're grappling with the members of the group currently.
Okay, thanks, Nusra. Yeah, now, you know, putting this together, as Nusra and I have done, as you can see, and we hope it's kind of as, you know, it's okay for all of you. And it's been very hard, particularly in what inevitably is a short period of time, to know what to include and what to exclude. And hopefully this particular slide, which you can all see, will help focus the mind and lead us into discussion and questions. So I'm just going to give a brief outline of each of these points, and then hope that we can, you know, move into a discussion on these. And as I've said here, each of these could be a seminar in themselves. So I will try and be brief but clear. So the Nationality and Borders Bill, it's at the report stage now, this week, back in the Commons, with amendments being proposed, which the RMCC has had a part in, and I've been involved in those amendments. And it's a pernicious, tragic piece of legislation, but very, very specifically for social work, one of the key areas that they've kind of snuck into this bill, and it's not getting much publicity outside of the social work arena and the RMCC arena, is about age assessment. Now, age assessment, I believe, is a misnomer in itself. You cannot assess age, and I've spent 20 years now on this, and it is a misnomer. It is wishful thinking. It is something that can be assessed. It can't be. This presents everybody with a huge problem, but with the social work profession, it presents us with a specific problem, because it is I always think of it as like a hot potato, a hot burning potato. It's been thrown at social work, and we've had no choice but to catch it, and we've got burnt. And the burns are a challenge. They take the form of a challenge to our ethical practice, and all sorts of issues about what is possible and what we should be doing alone, single agency, and what we should never do as single agency. And of course, assessment, as we all know, from all of the work and the tragedies that we had in the last, you know, this last week, more and more tragedy, assessment can never be single agency, and this work can never be single agency. And yet attributing this 24-hour slot when somebody was born X number of years ago, because that's what age assessment is all about, is held in the main single agency. And the NAB, the National Age Assessment Board, which is key integral part of this section of the Nationality and Borders Bill, is proposed, and it will be set up. There are already NAB pilots in practice now, and they are they are a body set up by the Home Office, single agency, where the Home Office is employing directly social workers, not local authorities, but the Home Office. And the bill will, when it becomes an act, which it will allow the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary, to write statutory guidance telling social workers how they will practice and how they will assess age. It's going to be, from the pilots, from what we see in the pilots, short assessment work, as I can only repeat again, single agency, without having allowed the children to rest, recover, without consulting with other agencies to attribute a date of birth. And it raises huge issues for us as a profession. And I think for BASW as an organisation and other social work bodies. I do work with Social Workers Without Borders, a lot of pro bono work, and it's also a challenge for Social Workers Without Borders. So can come back to age assessment in questions, and also if you ever want to ask me to come back and talk about that in greater depth, very happy to. So we've got the situation now with the there's lots of other things I could say about the bill, but I don't think we've got time. I'm focused on age assessments with the bill. Situation in the hotels with the newly arrived numbers coming in Kent. Now, the situation there, the fact is that the numbers, they're being concentrated in short periods of time, but the numbers are no higher than they've been in past times. And it is totally wrong, in my view, my personal and professional view, that children are now in Kent and in other places are being placed not in local authority care under Section 20, as looked after children, but alone in hotels without support, without immigration legal advice, and totally, in my view, illegally. It's a massive issue in itself. It links, the government says, to the National Transfer Scheme. So I'll go straight on to the National Transfer Scheme. This is a scheme, a voluntary scheme, where local authorities which have under a certain percentage, it's a very low percentage, under 1%, under 0 point something percent of asylum seeking children as a percentage of their looked after population, offer placements to separated asylum seeking children. It was voluntary. The government is now saying it will, in the new year, it hasn't done it yet, make the NTS, the National Transfer Scheme, compulsory on a temporary basis, not permanently. So it will be it'll be instructing local authorities who haven't yet taken children to do so. It raises all sorts of questions. I mean, personally, I think that there should be a mandatory national transfer scheme. And I think it is much better to have children in areas, for example, of the country where there are existing populations, where there are better services, where there are mental health services, and where there are culturally appropriate services. But, you know, it does raise many questions. Go back to unregulated placements, because that's a very important part of the social work scene, because we know that the government has made unregulated placements for over 16s now not illegal. And there is a very big issue because so many of the children coming in are 16 and 7. So they are disproportionately put into unregulated placements, and they don't get the same quality. One of the ethics that we powerfully believe should be that these are children first and migrants, immigrants, asylum seekers second, that social workers are not immigration officers, and we should focus on their needs, not their immigration status, and that they should receive full and equal treatment under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Children Act. One of the fears that we have is that it's the government's intention, we fear, to take these children out of the remit of the Children Act. And so that's a very significant, real and live threat that's on the horizon. And there's more than hints about this. There is a real undercurrent at the moment of concern within the sector that these children will be seen, that the words are used like, oh, it's inappropriate to use the Children Act for these children. No, it's not. They're children first. And there are some, if we listen to their voices and their needs, we must know that. And then the last thing on this list is no recourse to public funds, NRPF. again, this is a massive issue. This is about children and families who are and adults on their own, who are deemed, because of their immigration status, to not be entitled to public funds, and an entire alternative funding system, which I'm sure many of you know about, has been set up, and it demarcates these migrant children and adults to permanent poverty. And we know the impact of poverty on their lives, and particularly on children. You know, it's vicarious treatment because of what's happened to them, their families, and their life chances are significantly impinged and damaged by NRPF. I've hardly stopped for breath, and I think it's probably a lot for people to take in, Nushra, and these are the headlines behind these, you know, these bullets, and there's so much more that I could say. That are, I mean, I live and breathe this work, and as I have, and as you know, as did my mum and our family, and it's part of our DNA. And you know, this current phrase, the lived experience, it's not one I feel particularly akin with, but actually it is what it is. It is my lived experience, and it's powerfully influenced what I've done and why, as it did Mum's till her dying day.
Well,
Yeah.
Karen, thank you so much for sharing, you know, your family's history, your mum's journey here, and also just what an impact that's had on you as now a social worker, and the fact that, you know, you're still really fighting the corner for children in this position, and you've outlined some really serious concerns about the rights of children being even more compromised than they ever have been, and the important work that you do for BASW in this area. So I hope that will give a lot of food for thought now for the discussion, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you for asking, and thanks for interviewing me and helping me to share some of this. And I really hope that we have got the time for a discussion. And if anybody is interested, please, in joining the I8 SIG, it is open to everybody. It's really important that we hear the voice of practitioners and BASW members in the formation and the shaping of BASW policy. And I think that the SIGs are such an ideal way, because they can give a safe platform and a safe place and a safe group discussion place as well for the development of BASW's policy, and for helping us to share the knowledge and the information that we have.
Okay, so now it's over to everybody for the live discussion.
Great, thanks, Nushra.